She returned a knife to the Lakota warrior. And he told her what it really meant. The knife glinted in the dust like a warning sent by the wind itself, its carved bone handle half buried beside the torn grass where horses had passed. And the young woman froze the instant she saw the Lakota markings etched along the spine. Signs she didn't understand but felt in her bones she had no right to touch. Yet she reached for it anyway because leaving something this important, abandoned on a lonely trail, felt like disrespect toward whoever had dropped it. And fear or not, she refused to be careless with another person's belonging. Her hand shook as she lifted it, the blade heavier than she expected, its weight carrying the memory of a warrior's grip. And the moment her fingers closed around the handle, she felt the echo of 1,000 cautions she'd heard from the townsfolk. Never approach a Lakota camp, never cross into their valley, never speak unless spoken to, never hold anything that belongs to a warrior unless you're ready for the consequences. She swallowed hard. She hid the knife beneath her shawl. She kept glancing over her shoulder. The trail ahead narrowed between two ridges, where evening light turned the rocks amber, and every step she took seemed to thrum with the knowledge that the only honest thing to do was also the thing that terrified her most. Return the knife to the man who had carried it. She tried to tell herself she could leave it at the edge of the valley, set it on a rock, and run back before anyone noticed. But when she reached the rise overlooking the Lakota encampment, she saw him. Tall, broad-shouldered, braids brushing the chest of his doeskin shirt, his posture steady as he checked the rope on a horse's lead. The calm assurance of a man who lived by meaning rather than noise. And something in the quiet discipline of his movements made her breath catch as sharply as the first time she saw a thunderstorm building over open plains. He lifted his head, as if he sensed her presence long before he heard her footsteps, his dark eyes narrowing slightly in the fading light. Not in threat, but in awareness. And when she stepped into view, her heart hammered so loudly she was sure he could hear it from several paces away. She stopped at the edge of the camp, gripping the knife beneath her shawl with trembling fingers. And for a moment she almost turned back, almost ran, almost let fear swallow her, but the warrior stood so still, calm, patient, waiting, that her panic faltered under the weight of his quiet regard. She lowered her gaze. She took a slow breath. She stepped forward one careful pace. The other members of the camp paused in their work, some lifting their eyes with curiosity, others with caution, but none moved toward her, and the air carried that strange mix of tension and recognition found only in moments where two worlds meet by accident rather than design. The warrior walked toward her with the silent strength of someone who understood both boundaries and mercy, stopping just close enough that she felt the warmth of his shadow, and she hesitated before pulling the knife from beneath her shawl. Holding it with both shaking hands like a fragile truth she didn't know how to deliver. The warrior's eyes traveled from her trembling fingers to the blade, and something unreadable flickered across his expression. A shift so subtle she felt it more than she saw it. But he didn't reach for the knife. Not yet. Instead, he looked directly into her frightened eyes, as if he were measuring the distance between fear and intention. And in that suspended silence, she realized she hadn't simply returned a belonging. She had stepped into something far deeper, something he understood in ways she did not, something she had already changed by crossing the ridge. The Lakota warrior didn't reach for the knife right away, and the pause stretched long enough to make the young woman's breath tremble as she held the blade out between them, her fingers whitening around the handle as though the weight grew heavier with every heartbeat. She had imagined this moment 100 different ways during the climb down the ridge, him snatching it away, him shouting, him accusing her of trespass. But she had not imagined this stillness, this careful, measuring quiet that made her knees weak beneath her skirt. She shifted her grip. She lowered her gaze. She tried to steady her breathing. The warrior's eyes held hers with a patience that felt disarming, a quiet understanding that made her wonder if he had seen fear like hers many times before. And when he finally stepped forward, the angle of his movement held a kind of deliberate gentleness that made her chest tighten with relief and new anxiety all at once. The members of the camp watched from a respectful distance, their expressions calm but attentive, waiting to see what the exchange meant, and she felt the pressure of their gaze the way one feels the weight of a storm cloud, even when the sky is still clear. The warrior lifted his hand slowly, his palm facing upward. Not demanding, not claiming, simply offering a place for the knife to rest. But when she moved to set it down, her fingers brushed his skin by accident, a soft, startled contact that made her flinch back with an apology on her lips that never fully formed, because he didn't pull away, didn't stiffen, didn't let the moment turn into something sharp or shameful. He closed his hand around the knife only after giving her enough time to steady herself, and instead of stepping back, he inspected the blade with a slow, thoughtful motion, turning it once in the dim light before looking up with an expression she couldn't read, a mixture of acknowledgement and something more complex, something deeper, something she sensed mattered far more to him than the knife itself. She swallowed hard. She clasped her hands. She waited for the meaning to fall on her like judgment. The warrior finally spoke, his voice low and even, telling her she had crossed a boundary few outsiders approached without fear, and though his tone held no anger, the truth of it made heat rise in her cheeks as she apologized in a small, unsteady voice for trespassing, explaining that she found the knife on the trail and only wished to show respect by returning it directly rather than leaving it for the wind to carry away. At the word respect, something softened in his posture, a slight shift in his shoulders that made the women near the fire glance at each other with the quiet curiosity reserved for moments that matter. He stepped aside, motioning gently for her to follow him toward the open space near the fire, where the smoke drifted in thin ribbons into the early evening sky, and though her heart hammered at the thought of stepping deeper into a Lakota encampment, she did so because the calm in his eyes felt safer than the fear pulling at her ribs. She walked with slow, careful steps. She kept her hands close to her skirt. She tried not to stumble on the packed earth beneath her boots. The warrior stopped near the fire's edge and turned the knife in his hand once more, before saying, with quiet certainty, that returning a warrior's blade carried meaning, and that meaning wasn't small, wasn't accidental, wasn't something she could undo now that her fingers had wrapped around the handle. He didn't say yet what it meant, didn't tell her why the camp watched her with new attention, but the look in his eyes said the truth was coming, and it would change the way she understood not only him, but herself and the land she had stepped onto without fully knowing its rules. The fire crackled softly as the Lakota warrior moved a few steps around it, creating enough space for her to stand beside him without feeling trapped. And the young woman hesitated at the boundary between light and shadow, her breath catching as every instinct told her to stay at the edge, while something deeper, something steadier, pulled her forward toward the place where he waited with the knife resting loosely in his hand. The camp quieted around them, conversations fading into the wind, as if the entire valley held its breath to see what would happen next. And she stepped closer with slow, uncertain movements that stirred dust beneath her boots, each step a fragile reminder that she did not belong here yet, dared to come anyway. She clasped her hands. She kept her gaze lowered. She waited for permission to breathe. The warrior stood with one shoulder angled toward her, not fully facing her, yet not turning away, a posture that felt strangely protective, an invitation without demand, and when she finally lifted her eyes, she found him already watching her with that same heavy stillness that had shaken her on the ridge, the quiet kind of notice that came from a man who measured truth long before he measured words. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to, because the knife resting against his palm seemed to bridge the space between them better than language ever could, and he slowly extended it. Not toward her, not to return it, but to hold it between them point down so she could see it clearly, the angle of his hand asking a question she didn't yet understand. She felt her heart stumble. She felt her breath hitch. She felt the fear of doing something wrong flicker through her like a cold draft under a door. The warrior stepped closer until they shared the same firelight, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the knife sideways in his hand and brought it level with her height, showing her the worn pattern on its handle, the marks of years spent protecting land, family, and honor. She stared, barely blinking, as he rotated the blade with a gentleness that stunned her. Like he wasn't showing her a weapon, but a truth, a piece of himself he was choosing to let her see without needing to explain it yet. Her fingers twitched toward it, but she stopped herself, afraid she might offend, and the warrior watched that hesitation with an expression that softened almost imperceptibly before he closed the distance by half a step. Lifting his other hand to hover near hers, not touching, not guiding, just letting his warmth reach the back of her knuckles so she would know she wasn't overstepping by wanting to understand. She swallowed hard. She steadied her hands. She let her fingertips drift close to the bone handle. When she finally brushed it, just barely, the warrior lowered his gaze to the contact, and something shifted in his posture. A subtle release of tension, a quiet acceptance. Before he lifted the knife away again, not rejecting her touch, but ending the moment the way one ends a lesson once the student understands its first shape. He tucked the blade into his belt with a slow, respectful motion, then looked back at her, and though his expression remained unreadable to most eyes, she felt the meaning settle into her chest like a weight she didn't yet know how to name. He had accepted the way she returned the knife, accepted her sincerity, accepted her presence beneath the firelight, and the silence that followed didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt earned. She drew a trembling breath, unsure whether to thank him, to step back, or to stay exactly where she was. But when he shifted a single step to the side, making room for her beside the fire, she understood his answer without needing a single spoken word. Smoke lifted in thin ribbons into the cooling evening sky as she stood beside the fire, her breath slowing enough for her to notice the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. And when she finally gathered the courage to raise her eyes toward the Lakota warrior, he had already shifted his stance to face her fully, as if he'd been waiting for her to reclaim her breath before offering anything more. Tension fluttered against her ribs with the fragile insistence of a bird testing the air before flight. But she held her ground because something about his steady presence made running feel unnecessary for the first time all day. She gathered her shawl closer. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She drew one long, shaky breath into her lungs. The warrior watched her with a patient expression, not urging her to speak, not retreating, simply giving her the rare gift of being seen without being rushed, and that quiet space allowed her voice to finally slip past her lips in a soft confession that startled her even as it formed. She admitted she hadn't meant to cross into their valley, that she feared she had broken a rule she didn't understand, and that the knife felt too important to leave behind on the ground, even though touching a warrior's blade had terrified her more than the climb down the ridge. He listened without moving, his dark eyes steady, absorbing every tremor in her voice and every piece of truth she offered. And when she stumbled over her apology, half whispered, half swallowed, he lifted a hand lightly to halt her, not in reprimand but in reassurance, his palm angled in a calming gesture that eased the tightness gripping her throat. He spoke then, his voice low and even, saying her choice to return the knife was not a trespass, but a sign of courage, because many who feared his people would have left it where it fell, trusting fear over honesty, and the fact she crossed a ridge alone to put the blade back in a warrior's hand meant far more than she realized. She blinked rapidly. She steadied her shaking hands. She looked at him with a mix of relief and disbelief. The fire popped softly as he continued, explaining that a warrior's knife wasn't only a tool for survival, it carried responsibility, family, and the weight of protection, and anyone who returned it directly not only showed respect, but silently offered themselves into a moment of trust that his people didn't overlook lightly. Her breath caught as the meaning settled over her. Heavier and warmer than she expected, and she shook her head slightly, confessing she never meant to ask for trust or invitation, only to do what felt right when she saw something valuable abandoned in the dirt. He gave a small nod, acknowledging her intention, and the faint shift in his posture told her he accepted her sincerity even more deeply now that she had spoken it aloud. Camp members listened from a respectful distance, their expressions changing subtly as her voice carried across the firelight. And for the first time since she entered the valley, curiosity softened into admiration rather than suspicion. She brushed her thumb over the edge of her shawl. She forced her breath steady. She waited for his next words like someone bracing for truth. Instead of lecturing or questioning, he stepped closer with calm certainty, telling her in a firm but gentle tone that returning a knife asked something of a warrior too. It required him to acknowledge the honesty of the one who carried it back, to answer that honesty with clarity, and to explain what she had stepped into, because meaning is shared, not taken. Her knees weakened beneath the understanding that she hadn't just returned something lost. She had entered a conversation older than either of them, and the man standing before her was prepared to answer it with the same dignity she had shown by offering the blade. Warmth from the fire reached her only in small, flickering breaths, and as the tension of the day drained from her bones, she swayed slightly where she stood, her balance slipping like loose gravel beneath her feet, and the Lakota warrior noticed the change before she did, stepping forward with a steadying motion that caught her elbow just as her knees threatened to drop her toward the ground. Embarrassment flushed through her chest as quickly as fear, but he eased her downward with a calm, practiced gentleness, guiding her to sit on a fur-lined mat beside the fire, without making her feel small for being exhausted after hours of climbing, worrying, and carrying a weight of fear she had no one else to help her hold. She pressed a hand to her forehead. She tried to apologize. She struggled to steady her breath. The warrior stood only a moment before turning toward the nearest lodge, calling softly to an older woman who brought a wooden bowl filled with warm broth, her movements efficient and respectful as she placed it beside the young woman before stepping back again, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to the two who had shared the knife's path. The warrior crouched across from her and nudged the bowl gently toward her hands, watching her with the kind of attentiveness that came not from curiosity, but from responsibility, as if her well-being now rested inside the same invisible promise tied to the blade she had returned. She tried to lift the bowl, but her hands shook too badly, the day's fatigue catching up to her in a wave that made her shoulders slump with helpless frustration. And before she could force herself through it, the warrior shifted closer and steadied the bowl with one large hand, letting her hold only part of its weight while he carried the rest, making the effort shared instead of burdensome. She inhaled the steam. She let the warmth settle in her palms. She whispered a shaky thanks she hoped didn't sound as desperate as she felt. The first sip burned slightly, but it carried a comfort she couldn't swallow past without tears filling her eyes, and she tried to blink them away before they fell, wiping her cheek quickly with the back of her hand, only to find the warrior already looking at her with quiet understanding rather than pity. He encouraged her with a small nod, and she drank again. Slower this time, feeling the strength return to her limbs in careful increments as the firelight curved softly around them. He moved a folded blanket behind her back to support her posture, adjusting it with the care of someone who had tended the weak and weary before. And when she shivered despite the fire, he added another layer over her shoulders with a deliberate, respectful distance, ensuring she remained warm without crossing into closeness she had not invited. She drew a deeper breath. She let her fingers unclench. She rested her head against the blanket for a moment longer than she intended. A few children peeked from behind a lodge pole, their eyes wide with curiosity, but the adults guided them away gently, maintaining a respectful boundary around the vulnerable stranger who had stepped into their valley with more courage than sense. And the warrior's expression softened further at the sight, as if he understood the enormity of the day she had survived. When she finally managed to lift the bowl on her own, he leaned back slightly, giving her space while still watching over her with the same steady calm that had settled her trembling earlier. And by the time she finished the last sip, her breath no longer shook, her shoulders no longer curled in on themselves, and her gaze, though still cautious, held a fragile steadiness that hadn't been there when she first walked into camp with a knife she didn't understand. Night settled deeper across the encampment as stars sharpened above the pines, and the young woman drew her shawl close while the crackle of the fire steadied her breathing, her exhaustion melting into a quieter space that made her finally aware of how long she'd been running from fear she couldn't name. Across the fire, the Lakota warrior moved with slow, deliberate care as he checked the ties on the horses, his silhouette strong against the faint silver light. And when he returned to the fire, he paused not out of hesitation but to observe her with the quiet attentiveness of a man studying the weather before stepping into it. She folded her hands. She kept her eyes low. She waited for him to speak, though she wasn't sure she was ready for whatever truth he might offer next. Instead of words, he lowered himself to sit across from her, the fur lining beneath him softening the sound of his weight, and he rested his hands loosely on his knees, his posture steady, open, and unhurried. The kind of presence that made her heart beat slow even when her nerves still quivered in small aftershocks of the day. She blinked at him uncertainly. She tucked her feet beneath her skirt. She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. The warrior studied her in silence, his expression unreadable but not cold, and then, without warning or ceremony, he removed the knife from his belt and set it gently on the ground between them, not pointing toward her, not placing it within easy reach, but laying it flat with deliberate respect, as if the earth itself needed to bear witness to the gesture. Her breath stilled as she stared at the blade, the firelight flickering across its surface in thin, warm lines, and she felt the meaning even before he lifted his eyes to hers. Not a challenge, not a command, but a wordless acknowledgement that she had stepped into something deeper than a simple return of property. No wind stirred the moment, no voices rose from the camp, no explanation passed his lips. He simply held her gaze, waiting for her to understand in her own time. Her throat tightened. Her fingers twitched against the edge of her shawl. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't form out loud. He reached forward with 2 fingers and nudged the knife an inch closer to her, not offering it, not demanding she take it, but letting her know the story of the blade wasn't finished just because she had delivered it back into his hand earlier. She inhaled sharply, uncertainty and awe tangling inside her chest as she realized he wasn't asking for anything. He was showing her that the meaning tied to returning a warrior's knife wasn't a one-sided truth, but something shared between 2 people who had met in honesty. A quiet wind swept around them, stirring her hair slightly, but neither of them moved, And when she finally lifted her hand, she didn't touch the knife. She simply placed her palm flat against the ground near it, mirroring his gesture, an instinctive response that surprised her as much as it softened the warrior's eyes. He inclined his head once, the subtle dip heavy with significance, and then he rose to his feet with a slow, respectful motion, stepping back to give her space while maintaining the protective awareness that had followed her since she entered the valley. She watched him walk a short distance toward the shadows before he paused, glanced back at her once more, and let the silence finish, speaking the promise he wasn't ready to say aloud. This moment had bound their paths in a way neither of them fully understood yet, but neither of them feared anymore. Morning light slid across the valley in long, pale sweeps as she made her way toward the ridge with slow, hesitant steps, carrying both the weight of the previous night's truth and the fragile calm the warrior's silence had given her. But the peace unraveled the moment she reached the rise overlooking the trail home and saw a cluster of townsfolk waiting, their figures stiff and uneasy in the early light, as if they had gathered out of worry they didn't want to admit. She paused halfway up the slope, breath catching as old fear tightened its grip around her ribs, because returning to town after spending a night in the Lakota encampment felt like stepping into judgment with no hiding place, and the knife's meaning still pulsed inside her chest, like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to carry alone. She touched her shawl. She steadied her breath. She braced herself for the words she knew were coming. One of the older men stepped forward first, suspicion already etched into the narrow line of his mouth as he demanded to know why she had wandered into their territory, his voice carrying the sharp edge of fear disguised as authority. And another woman whispered something about dangers and impropriety, shaking her head as though the mere idea of speaking to a warrior violated some unspoken rule laid out by the town's long-standing ignorance. She tried to explain, but her voice faltered as faces she once trusted hardened into cautious scrutiny, and she felt the sting of being misunderstood coil through her chest like a fresh bruise. She lifted her chin. She folded her trembling hands. She tried again with a steadier breath. This time her words managed to break through. She told them she'd found a knife on the trail, that returning it had seemed the right thing to do, and that nothing more had happened than what decency required. But the crowd exchanged glances loaded with assumptions they formed faster than reason could reach them. The older man muttered that warriors didn't drop blades without intention, and a younger ranch hand added that people who crossed into the valley often came back changed, the vague accusation casting a shadow over her sincerity. Wind brushed across the ridge, tugging lightly at her shawl as she struggled to hold her ground, and she wished, quietly, fiercely, that someone, anyone, would believe her without weighing her words against old fears. She glanced over her shoulder toward the valley below, half hoping to see the warrior's silhouette against the pines, not because she expected him to appear, but because his steady presence had become the anchor she hadn't known she needed. She inhaled. She found her voice again. She stood taller. But before she could speak, a sharp gasp rippled through the group as the Lakota warrior himself appeared at the edge of the trees, walking toward the ridge with a measured stride that carried no threat, only certainty, and the shift in the townsfolk's posture was immediate, a sudden reel of tension mixed with awe and fear, as if they had never expected a man of his stature to approach them calmly. He stopped several paces behind her, offering her space while making it clear he had come with purpose, and though he said nothing yet. The quiet weight of his presence pressed against the morning air like a truth the town could no longer ignore. She felt her breath steady just a little. She felt her spine strengthen. She felt the fear inside her break into smaller pieces she could finally breathe around. The older man stepped back. A woman lowered her eyes. No one spoke as the warrior watched them with the calm, unshakable dignity of someone who was not here to defend himself, but to stand witness for her. Voices tightened around the ridge as the Lakota warrior stepped into full view, his calm presence unsettling the townsfolk more effectively than any raised voice could, and the young woman felt the tension thicken around her like a rope pulled taut, the crowd shifting between fear, pride, and the uneasy realization that whatever judgment they intended to cast would no longer fall onto someone standing alone. Sunlight caught the warrior's braids, the dark strands gleaming as he moved with deliberate steadiness to stand several paces behind her, close enough to be her shield, without taking away her right to speak for herself. And the onlookers reacted with nervous murmurs, retreating a step even though he kept his hands empty and his stance unthreatening. She clasped her shawl near her throat. She forced her trembling to still. She prepared for the moment everything might turn against her. The older man who'd confronted her earlier tried to reclaim his authority, demanding to know why the warrior had followed her, and he delivered the accusation with a trembling bravado that cracked in the middle as if he knew deep down that fear, not reason, drove every word. A ranch hand muttered that the valley had rules, while a woman insisted that her return from the Lakota camp meant she had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and the harshness of their voices tightened something cold and old inside her chest, a familiar fear she thought she had left behind when the warrior's silence steadied her the night before. She stepped forward anyway. She breathed once, slowly. She spoke her truth clearly enough for all of them to hear. Her words cut through the noise. She had found a knife. She had returned it, nothing more. And though her voice shook at the edges, the steadiness at its core surprised even her, echoing with the calm she had absorbed from the warrior's presence. A few townsfolk exchanged uncertain glances. One woman softened. A man looked away, ashamed. But the older man pushed again, insisting that returning a warrior's blade was a bold act, meant to signal something unseemly, his tone laced with fear disguised as certainty, and she felt her breath falter until a deep, steady voice rose behind her and silenced the ridge with more power than a shout ever could. The warrior spoke in measured English, each word shaped by quiet respect rather than anger, as he explained that she had shown courage, not impropriety, by returning something sacred directly into its owner's hand, that her gesture carried honor, not offense, and that his presence here today was not a pursuit but a response to the trust she had offered in placing the blade back into his palm. The crowd stilled, struck not by volume, but by the certainty in his tone. She blinked rapidly. She steadied her shaking breath. She felt her spine straighten beneath the weight of his words. The warrior stepped forward one pace, not enough to threaten, but enough to stand openly in support. And he added that anyone who judged her for an act of respect judged their own fear more than her actions, and the quiet shame rippling through the group revealed his truth had found its mark. A few people lowered their eyes, humbled. A woman whispered that she hadn't understood. Even the older man faltered, grasping for words that refused to form beneath the warrior's calm gaze. The wind shifted across the ridge, carrying away the last notes of hostility, and when the warrior finally fell silent, the world around them held a stillness that felt like a verdict delivered, not by force, but by dignity. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the ridge, she realized she was no longer defending herself. The truth had done it for her. No one moved at first, as if the ridge itself needed time to absorb the warrior's words before allowing breath back into the air, and the young woman stood suspended in that fragile stillness while the townsfolk shifted uneasily, their faces reflecting something she had not expected to see. Uncertainty softening into the slow, awkward beginnings of understanding. Sunlight brushed the tops of the pines, casting long, slanted beams across the ground where she stood, And when she met the eyes of the woman who had accused her earlier, the harshness there had dissolved into something more human, something that looked almost like regret. She tucked her hands close. She steadied her posture. She tried not to crumble beneath the sudden tenderness rising in her chest. A mother stepped forward first. Her expression lined with a mix of guilt and sympathy as she admitted she wouldn't have had the courage to walk into the valley alone to return something precious to its rightful owner, and the simple honesty in her voice broke apart the tension that had held the ridge hostage since dawn. A ranch hand nodded next, rubbing the back of his neck as he muttered that fear had made fools of them more than once, and a teenage boy dropped his gaze, kicking at the dirt as he whispered that he shouldn't have spoken badly without knowing the truth. The admission quiet, but sincere. Faces softened one by one, not quickly, not perfectly, but in the uneven, humble way people shift when truth pushes old fear aside. She drew a breath that didn't tremble. She lowered her gaze in gratitude. She held her shawl gently instead of gripping it with fear. Behind her, the warrior remained silent, allowing the moment to belong to her alone, his presence steady but unintrusive as he watched the slow change ripple through the group with the patience of a man who understood that dignity wasn't taken. It was recognized. The sheriff finally stepped forward, hat in hand, and acknowledged that he had misread her actions, admitting that fear of the unfamiliar had pushed him to suspicion rather than sense. And though the apology was stiff around the edges, it carried enough sincerity to make her blink rapidly against the sting behind her eyes. A faint breeze swept across the ridge, lifting the loose strands of her hair and carrying the warmth of the morning sun with it. And she felt herself exhale fully for the first time since reaching the valley. The pressure inside her chest easing as the weight of judgment loosened its hold. She thanked them with a quiet voice that carried farther than she expected, and several townsfolk nodded in return, some with shy half-smiles, others with softened eyes, all recognizing that standing on this ridge had changed more than her fate. It had changed their understanding of the people who lived beyond it. The warrior stepped forward only after the moment had fully settled, placing himself at her side with a respectful distance that made his support unmistakable, yet unforced. And the townsfolk stepped back instinctively, giving space not out of fear, but out of a newfound respect they didn't yet know how to articulate. She glanced up at him, her heart catching at the strength in his calm posture, and he met her gaze briefly with a small, steady nod that said he saw her courage just as clearly as she felt the shield of his presence. The ridge no longer felt divided between two worlds. It felt like the first place where those worlds had finally acknowledged one another without suspicion. And when she turned toward the path leading home, the warrior's quiet step falling in behind hers made it clear that this moment of recognition wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something neither of them had understood until they stood together beneath the rising sun. Soft light spread over the open trail as she walked down from the ridge, each step carrying her farther from fear and closer to a kind of stillness she had never known. And behind her the Lakota warrior followed at a respectful distance, not acting as her escort or shadow, but as someone ensuring the world did not turn harsh again before she reached the safety of her own breath. Dew clung to the grass, brushing against her shoes in cool strokes, and the quiet of morning wrapped around them in a way that made every sound, every distant bird call, every soft exhale of wind, echo like a reminder that peace could exist even after a night filled with worry. She paused near a fallen log to catch her breath, resting her hand on its rough surface while the valley opened behind her in sweeping shades of gold and blue. And the warrior halted several paces back, keeping his posture relaxed and his gaze lowered so she never felt pressed by his presence. She closed her eyes. She inhaled deeply. She let the last traces of yesterday's fear slip out of her shoulders. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Not because words were lacking, but because silence had become the one language both could trust. She turned slightly, offering him a grateful nod, and he returned it with the quiet assurance of a man who understood that gratitude meant more when left unclaimed rather than answered aloud. A lone breeze pushed through the tall grass, brushing her skirt and sending a ripple across the meadow like a page being turned gently, and she stepped forward again, making her way toward town, where the roofs glimmered faintly in the morning sun. No longer a place filled with judgment, but a place recovering from its own misunderstanding. When the path dipped near a stream, she knelt to splash cool water across her hands, surprised by how steady they felt now. Her reflection trembled softly on the water's surface, looking back at her with eyes she barely recognized. Eyes no longer clouded by fear, but shaped by something steadier, earned through truth, and defended by someone who had no obligation to defend her at all. The warrior stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the horizon rather than her, giving her space to gather herself without feeling observed, and when she rose again, she offered him a small gesture of thanks by touching 2 fingers lightly to the fabric of her shawl, a gesture he acknowledged with the faintest incline of his head, respectful and unintrusive. They continued along the trail until the first fence posts of town appeared in the distance, and she slowed, realizing this was where their paths naturally separated. She turned fully toward him, unsure how to express everything she felt without overstepping the dignity of the moment, but he lifted a hand. Open, calm, steady, and that simple gesture granted her more reassurance than any sentence could. She whispered a soft goodbye. She kept her voice steady. She meant every syllable. He answered with a quiet phrase in his own language, not to bind her to anything, not to pull her into a world she did not yet understand, but to honor the courage she had shown when returning a blade that carried history heavier than words. Then he stepped back, fading into the pines with the same quiet certainty he had carried since the moment he first appeared on the ridge, leaving her with nothing but the soft glow of dawn and the knowledge that truth, spoken with dignity, had changed more than just her day. She walked the last stretch alone, not trembling now, not afraid, carrying forward a calm stronger than fear, and a memory she knew would stay with her long after the sun climbed fully into the sky.